So thanks once again for joining us. We do have a critical mass now building up in numbers, and with the clock just switching there to 14:31 GMT, I think it's time to kick off. And I'll start by saying a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone on this call, because I know that we do have people joining us today from across America and Canada, as well as Laos and Singapore in Southeast Asia, in addition to guests joining us from across the UK. So a really warm welcome to this webinar from all of us to all of you. My name's Thomas Chalmers, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Russell Borland and Jane Welsh. We're going to be facilitating the session on, as you can see, inclusive leadership, and we're going to be digging into this theme of what makes an inclusive leader, and really exploring the lessons learned from leading during COVID-19. Now, this session, as you'll be aware, is running for 60 minutes, and it's come out of research that we've been doing into how leaders grow and develop. And as you can see from this slide, during our research, we could see that leaders develop in a number of ways, especially those below the red arrow that you can see here. So technical expertise, emotional development, that awareness broadening, those awareness broadening experiences. But what we really found, which was somewhat of a surprise to us, was that leaders are really impacted by their influencers. And you can see those listed above the red arrow there, from family right up to other leaders. And we're really delighted today to be joined by 4 speakers on this panel who really are wonderful leaders and influencers in their own right. And I'm going to introduce them in surname alphabetical order. Our first panelist being Dean Aloise, as you can see, Managing Director, US Buck. Buck being the global HR consulting, administration, and technology firm. Dean, we're really delighted, that you're joining us today from Pittsburgh, logging in there. Russell and I know that you're a highly respected leader, both within Buck and beyond Buck, and it's a real delight and pleasure, to have you on this call. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Thomas. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you, Dean. And to Steve Butler, as you can see, Chief Executive of the major national retirement savings business, Punter, Southall, Aspire. Steve's also an academic. He's a researcher, a business author, and a campaigner for diversity at work. Again, welcome, Steve. It's great to have you on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. From a sunny London, I shall try not to squint.
Very good. Thanks, Steve. Thank you. And then to a leader that I'm sure many of you will already be familiar with, Baroness Helena Morrissey, former CEO of Newton Investment Management, founder of the 30% Club, now a financier, author, and campaigner, non-executive director, and chair of the Diversity Project. And, if you haven't already listened to it, I can highly recommend Helena's interview on BBC Radio 4's Desert Island Discs podcast. It really is worth a listen. So, Helena, delighted that you've been able to join us today. Thank you again.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you. And our 4th and final panelist is Tracey Robb Perera. Tracey's an advocate of inclusive leadership. She's a former director of KPMG, really with multiple sector experience. She's now a non-executive director, advising the tech industry, and is current chair of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland. Tracey, once again, really delighted that you've been able to join us today. It's a delight to have you on this panel.
Thank you, Thomas. Great to be here with everyone.
Thanks, Tracey. And with numbers I see now approaching 120, a warm welcome once again to our guests, to you out there joining us. Delighted that you've been able to log in. Please do engage with our panelists through the Q&A function. You should find that on your control bar, either at the top or the foot of your screen. Russell's going to be monitoring that Q&A with Jane. So as I say, please do engage with our panel, and we'll endeavour to answer all of your questions during the session. So with that said, with those introductions made, I'm going to hand you over now to Jane, who's going to facilitate this discussion. Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Thomas. So I thought I'd just quote a couple of studies that have been around, that have come out in the last year or so, which I think are relevant to the discussion today. So Dev Modi has recently published a book called The Inclusive Leader Scorecard. And in it, he talks about the 4 areas where a leader can demonstrate inclusion. It's about how they lead themselves. So how they model inclusion, how they demonstrate their sense of purpose, exhibit courage and self-awareness. It's also about how they lead others. So are they building and supporting their teams in an inclusive way, encouraging honesty, challenge, building psychological safety? It's also, he suggests, about how leaders lead their culture, how they grow an inclusive culture that's more resilient, that delivers autonomy for individuals and so on. And then finally, he talks about the importance of leading externally as well, that the inclusive leader will be thinking about how they can build trust with their key stakeholders, how they can partner with external organizations and take an activist stance on issues sort of beyond their own organization. So I'm sure we will touch on a number of those aspects of inclusive leadership through the panel. But to what extent are those aspects of inclusive leadership in place at the moment in our organizations? Accenture last year produced an equality report, and they asked a question of both leaders and employers. And I'd like to see what the audience thinks of those statements today. So Thomas, if we could have the first poll, that would be great.
Yes, sure, Jane. So the first poll is, the question is, I work in an empowering organisation where I can be authentic, raise concerns and innovate without fear of failure. Just launching that poll now, you'll see the options to respond.
So just to repeat, Thomas, so this is to what extent are you working in that sort of inclusive culture? And if you could answer between strongly agree and strongly disagree, and then we'll see what comes back.
So we have 70% response rate so far, rising rapidly. Just over 80% voting now. And I think we can probably stop there. Jane, if you're happy, yeah. That's
very happy. Yeah.
Critical mass of 101 respondents there. Just ending the poll and sharing the results now. So
we have well, that's great. That's great. I'm delighted by that result. You know, the vast majority, 2/3, saying that they work in an organisation which allows them to be authentic, raise concerns, and so on. What was interesting was that the Accenture study results were less positive than this. They found that while 2/3 of leaders felt that they worked in an organisation that empowered people, only 1/3 of their employees agreed with that statement. So there was a bit of a gap between what leaders thought and what the employees felt. I don't know whether we're picking up the same thing today, but we'll come back to that point later in the conversation. So thank you for taking part in the poll. So I'd like to now move over to the panel and invite each member of the panel to just give a quick few words as to what inclusive leadership means to them. So I'd like to start with Dean, if I could.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Jane. So if I could distill it down to just a few words, 3 words that are really impactful for me as far as inclusive leadership goes are humility, diversity, and vulnerability. Especially those humility and vulnerability kind of going hand in hand a bit, but I think those are really key aspects of inclusive leadership.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm sure we can touch again on what those words mean for you later on. Can I ask Tracey for your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, so mine's it's not a few words, but it's a couple of sentences. I think for me, inclusive leadership is around leading from the top and leading by example. It's about creating a safe workplace where everyone can speak up and everyone can listen up, so that all talent lives to their full potential and works to their full potential, and that the business is optimal in their productivity.
Super, thank you very much. Steve, what are your thoughts on inclusive leadership?
I've gone back to the 3 word format. So I think firstly, it's about creating an environment that's respectful. You know, we have to have an environment where everyone trusts one another and kind of respects the views of everyone. I think it means everyone bringing a level of honesty to the workplace, perhaps more than we've had in the past. And I think bringing those 2 things together, it's then about creating a very collaborative environment for everyone to kind of work together in that way.
Thank you, Steve. And Helena, what are your thoughts on this one?
So I was going with the 3 word format, but I actually wanted to use 4, so I shall cheat because Tracey's already done that. So first one for me was empathetic. I think someone who really takes time to understand, who really kind of gets inside somebody else's kind of, what they're feeling. I think that's incredibly important. Involved. So the opposite of somebody who's sort of command and control and just tells people what to do, and someone gets in and stuck into the actual actions. Inspiring. I think that's quite an important one for me, because I think that's where the leading comes in, but you can be inspiring without doing everything yourself and without sort of telling everybody what to do. And lastly, I'd like to echo Dean's point about humility, because the most inclusive leaders that I know are very aware that they don't have all the answers to all the problems. And they have enough humility to recognize that. And I think that is critical.
Thanks, Helena. And while we're talking to you, perhaps you could give some thought as to why you think there might be a gap between the leaders' perspective of inclusion and their employees, as outlined by the Accenture report.
Yeah, so I'm delighted, of course, that our poll of the people listening is a bit different, but I think often there is this gap. And I do attribute that to predominantly a lack of self-awareness on the part of those leaders. There are so many examples where people think they're behaving in an inclusive way, but actually they are just occasionally asking someone their opinion, for example. And they're talking at people rather than talking with them and really soliciting their viewpoint. I think it involves really being inclusive, involves a very different mindset, as I said, an awareness that although you're the leader and the decision might lie on your shoulders or rest with you, you don't have all the ideas, you don't have all the answers. And, I worked with somebody, the founder of Newton, I think Thomas mentioned that I had been CEO there, but the person who set up the firm, Stuart Newton, was a genuinely inclusive leader. Now, I didn't realize that was how I could describe him at the time. And I started working there sort of 3 decades or so ago. But he was genuinely curious. And for example, what I, as a very junior analyst, thought and had to say. And so he wasn't just sort of saying, oh, I'm very inclusive, please just tell me what you think, and then got on with what he was going to do anyway. He listened. It amazed me, if I'm honest. It amazed me that someone was interested in an opinion of somebody who was, really still in their 20s and really very junior compared with the wonderful things he had done. But he was curious and he wanted to know. And that was so inclusive compared with somebody who just, lets somebody talk. And it showed me what really being an inclusive leader is. And I'm afraid, I think that's quite rare still. I think it's, I think people now are more inclined, and I don't want to encourage people to think that they were wrong in terms of the way they voted just now, But I think often people are more inclined to go through the motions a little bit and to act very much like they're an inclusive leader, but actually not necessarily be thinking in that way, which is why I wanted that word involved in my sort of set of attributes, and genuinely sort of in the frame of things.
Thanks for that, Helena. And Tracey, it's also important to kind of go back and explain why it matters to be inclusive. Can you sort of give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I want to mention 3 different things and then just a little story. But putting in context, I think it's really important that everyone has the responsibility of creating that inclusive culture. And there's 3 things I'd like to say that are benefits, I would say, is empowering, challenge and innovation. So everyone has a chance to speak up and listen up. I think secondly, it's around having that high performing teams that really have that positive behaviour that it spreads. And thirdly, it's around that increased performance, productivity, retention of staff, and actually reduce cost, ultimately, reduce mistakes. And the story I'd like to share is actually a time 2 years ago where I was looking at no deal Brexit planning, but crisis of day one and what that looked like. And I had to bring on a new work stream, new projects. And as part of that, new people came on board. And one of them was a junior who was a Black Canadian. And so I had to really quickly get him up to speed on what was the big picture. But obviously with the UK and the EU politics, it was quite a strange thing for him. So what I did was I actually brought him into one of our leadership meetings. So typically he would never be in that environment. And it was a case of actually not just getting him to come in, but have something to say and be invited to listen to the whole discussion. And the result was just unbelievable. When he came out of that meeting, he was so full of ideas, full of questions that were really relevant to the big picture, and his motivation just shot up overnight. I mean, it was outstanding. And the impact on the team was that his motivation and enthusiasm was really spread across the group and across the team, to the point that I brought a lot more people into the leadership decision-making process. And the positive reaction was that actually a lot of people then were outperforming what we originally thought they would be doing. So in their own expectation as well as everyone else's, and volunteering to get involved in other things. So again, it comes down to 3 things: empowering, challenge and innovation. So everyone really has that chance to speak up and listen up. And secondly, it's having that high performing team environment where everyone is really positive in their behaviour and they're spreading that. And then thirdly, it's around productivity that's increased, the performance is increased, reduce mistakes, and then it's employee retention, which is always what we want.
Yeah, I love that idea of bringing in sort of a different generation into the decision making. I mean, some organisations have shadow boards and things like that, don't they, as a way of ensuring that they're hearing from different parts of the organisation. And I suppose reverse mentoring might be another way of hearing from different voices, but it's a great example. Thank you. Steve, in our previous conversations, you've talked about how inclusion is you see it as a very important part of what you want your organisation to be about. Could you talk a little bit about that and what you've done in practice?
Yeah, I mean, in practice, my business has grown quite quickly over recent years through acquisition. And we're kind of in the investment and savings industry in the UK, which because of history is very male dominated. And I found myself 3 years ago with an executive committee of 8 men, white men in their 50s, and decided that presented quite a significant risk to me, because they all kind of had the same views and perhaps weren't looking and inquisitive more broadly than that. Short of firing them all, I had to think about how I could kind of fix the situation. So what I actually did was disband the executive committee, and I replaced it with 7 operating committees, which allowed a much broader set of people to get involved in the kind of leadership and strategy conversations from across the business. So, younger members of the team were able to get involved in their specialist areas. We saw participation from women in the kind of management and strategy function go from 0 to 38% in that one move. And by not having that executive committee, it allowed those operating committees to have a much broader, diverse conversation led by a much more diverse set of people. So that one thing saved me firing my executives, but it also shifted the culture of the business massively in a very short space of time. However, I was still left with my executive team. So, you know, we actually went further and said, right, actually those senior individuals, which I have to have because of the senior manager regime in the UK, all have reverse mentors, and they meet their reverse mentor monthly. And we've given them a framework for those meetings in that they kind of talk through decisions that they've made over the course of the month, interactions that they've had, with the responsibility of the mentor to just provide that different perspective on those decisions. And again, some very positive changes in culture off the back of those. And I now find when I'm talking to my senior execs, their conversations often start with "my reverse mentor said," which I take as very positive encouragement that you know, we've got a very broad set of views shaping the direction of business now.
And great to hear that your leaders are sort of acknowledging the value of those individuals and giving them.
It wasn't, there was resistance at the start, but you know, we had to kind of work through that with any change. Thank
you, Steve. I'd just like to pause at this point, Russell, to see if there are any questions coming through that we might want to pick up at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Yeah, a couple of great questions. First from Tom McCallum, who could really relate to the key points the panelists were talking about in terms of his own perspective on inclusive leadership, humility, or being humble, hungry, and open. The one word that Tom was saying, do we need to be brave as leaders? And he'd just appreciate any input from the panel as to, you know, do we need bravery as leaders in going forward?
Dean, you're nodding, so maybe I could ask you to comment on that.
Absolutely. I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I think it goes hand in hand with to be humble or to be vulnerable as a leader. It requires a lot of bravery. You have to be bold and confident in yourself and brave to show vulnerability, to admit. I think Helena said it well. You have to admit you don't know all the answers. Just because you're in that leadership role doesn't mean you have all the solutions. And just by admitting you need to rely on, say, a reverse mentor for much needed input, that takes a lot of bravery. So I think that's a key element.
Yeah, and I think you should also lead by example and be yourself, because I think when you're being your true authentic self, then you're encouraging others to do the same.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to add for that, if I may, I mean, I think, you know, we often talk about these things. We say, well, people need courage and they need to be vulnerable and so forth. But it is incredibly difficult. We make it incredibly difficult for people to step out of line, to say things that aren't conventional. And again, going back to sort of what Tracey just said, you know, you've got to lead by example there. And if you want people to come up with perhaps unconventional thinking that will be the solution to the problem that you have to give them the license to do that, and they'll only get the sense of that's allowed if I'm not saying rush around breaking all the rules. I'm just saying you need to actually speak up when something is not right. You need to call out bad behaviors. You need to push the envelope sometimes when something is not right in your industry. And I am perennially, I'm afraid, dismayed by sort of lack of willingness people have to put their head, well, they may say above the parapet, but it just seems to me if we're ever going to sort of really improve things, move forward, then we all have to do a little bit more of that. So I think it would be a great message from this discussion if we collectively encourage people to just do something that's a bit outside their comfort zone as part of what it means to be an inclusive leader and to show the way. We could achieve so much more in our businesses and in our organizations.
Well, Helena, I think one of my favorite phrases of yours is leap before you look, which is a sort of similar sort of
way round. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people, they look and they look and they look and they never leap. And, you know, I often use it in the context of women network, because often I've seen that a lot of women are very anxious about what can go wrong. So I think a leader that shows that actually it's okay to take a risk, which perhaps is the same as sort of being courageous, will imbue that sense in the people that they're leading as well. And again, I've seen that work to great effect in companies where I've worked, where somebody has been, quite edgy really about challenging conventional thinking, and it's been completely the right thing. But they've given other people the license to do the same.
And to make mistakes and not be penalized for that.
Exactly. We're all going to fail. Just, how we deal with that is what makes a business or a person ultimately successful. So, and it's not really, as I said, the last, perhaps don't mean to monopolize it, but the last, says that's not really the way it works in a lot of places, still. And that's why I think anybody who's listening who feels they can do a bit, should do it, to actually be a bit vulnerable, be a bit sort of pushing yourself out there sometimes where something needs challenging.
Thank you. Well, I'll come back to Russell's questions in a minute, but I think that leads very nicely on to a question for Tracey around this concept of psychological safety, because I think we've been talking about that really, about creating that environment where it's okay to make mistakes. Could you talk a little bit more about your thinking around that topic?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's four key things I want to mention, but just to put it in context, I think, again, psychological safety is about everyone taking responsibility to create that safe place, and the leader to really set that example. As we said already today, now it's about leading by example. And I think it's so key that psychological safety exists when you're in a fast-paced, fast-growth environment where you need to be innovative and creative in your thinking and to be able to fail fast. But also it's entirely appropriate that psychological safety also exists in organisations where you're dealing with horizon planning, contingency planning, and crisis management, which is so key now during COVID times. Now, I really came about looking at psychological safety in quite a key way when I was leading that whole plan 2018, brought in to be the Brexit programme director at KPMG, and no one had all the answers. Just like Dean said, no one person had all the answers. No one had gone through that before. It was a case of not just working with 10 people, but actually bringing 50 different people across the organisation together that never spoke to each other before and never knew that they needed to be interacting. And it's about really setting the space for them to be able to have real openness. And what ended up happening was that we uncovered an issue that ended up being critical for all 17,000 people to work from home when COVID hit more than a year and a half later. So it was really important that psychological safety existed. And the four key things when I look back that existed was, four things were, number one, we, not me as a culture. 2 was about openness. 3 was about curiosity. And 4 was about ideas. Now, if I take each of them in turn, the we, not me culture, what I mean by that is around how you have the shared purpose and the collectively shared vision, and you create that vision together. Obviously, in all organisations, quite a lot of them already have their values, but what does that really mean in terms of practice? So it's getting everyone together to actually air out what they feel are the ground rules, and that everyone's held accountable to those, and they're all bought into it. So it's really creating that culture of we, not me, and that shared goals and purpose. Secondly, then, is around openness. It's that open and honest culture where everyone has that mutual respect. The leaders are present and always present and reachable and accessible. And it's really important that you have that free flow of communication and that's consistent. What that does is really it builds trust, and it's amazing when that really does exist and how that feels in a team environment. And thirdly is around curiosity. We talked about this before, about not being able to fear of failure. It's actually about creating that environment where people can just air their concerns, bring up questions without worrying about what ridicule they're going to have. It's bringing up all those worries that they have and maybe mistakes that they've made in the past that they had to hide, and actually uncover those, because this is about creating a no blame culture, no ridicule, no humiliation, being able to come together to create those solutions together. So understand those root causes so you don't make those mistakes again, but it's actually about how do we create those solutions going forward. So that leads me on to the fourth one, which is ideas. Now, more often than not, we're on the hamster wheel It's so important to create that safe place to collate and think about big ideas, because that's where real innovation happens. And it's about testing those ideas and evolving them. And it's about breaking down silos. So you're bringing different people into the room, different levels, but also different backgrounds and different responsibilities. And actually the ideas that come about are amazing. So, the results are increased productivity, increased performance, as I mentioned before, great motivation, teams, and you come up with really good solutions where you're mitigating risk. So actually there's reduced cost. So the impact is on the bottom line in a positive way.
Fantastic, thank you. Dean, I think just following on from that, I know you've done some work in your organisation to try and kind of break down some of the barriers between different sort of areas of the business. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Jane. And I think, we're hearing a lot of these themes today. I know, Tracey just shared and Steve shared too, how they've tackled this issue of having this gap between leadership, maybe a not so diverse current leadership team, and then this really high potential group of non-leaders that might have critical things to contribute to the business. So we've also taken that head on at Buck, and something that we've done for the past 2 years now at Buck is really try to make that a formal program. We call it the Buck Future Leaders Program. And we make sure that group of future leaders is a very diverse and well-rounded group. And a couple of things that really make it unique, I believe. The first thing is that we don't just put these folks into a leadership program and train them and tell them what to do. We really do, as you've heard these other examples, we bring that group behind the curtain, we call it. We'll bring them into real issues that the leadership team is dealing with, and we throw them right into the meetings with us, and we look for their input. We have them take on parts of the decision-making process. So we throw them into the deep end and have them participate as a leader. The second thing, though, that's really important, we shouldn't just expect these future leaders to be able to kind of keep up with the pace of what's expected of them. So we also invest heavily in giving them personalized coaching. So with a little plug here, with the help of Leading Figures, we are having each one of those individuals, and we have 46 people in the program right now. So it's a pretty broad program. They're getting one-on-one leadership coaching while also being put behind the curtain in real leadership dilemmas at the company at the same time. So that's a way to break down that notion of us and them, and the leaders are disconnected with the employees, and it really pushes all that together with the right kind of training and support along the way. So so far we've found that to be a really difference maker for us, and we're going to keep trying to expand that kind of program going forward.
Fantastic, thank you. It's a great example. Steve, I know you've spoken in the past about how you've been trying to create a more inclusive environment in your senior team meetings, your project team meetings, and so on. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think, we talk about bringing a kind of broader, diverser group of people together to collaborate, and that's only half the issue. The real issue is to get them working together and to feel safe working together. And often we all come to meetings and we bring things with us, and that impacts on the way we interact and the way that we see our colleagues in the meetings. So we've set about across the entire business now, when we have a project meeting or a leadership meeting, we always start with a sign-in process. That classic icebreaker that you do on kind of training courses is now part of what we do in our meetings. So we have a standard sign-in where we all have to score our business life out of 10 and explain why. We have to score our personal life out of 10 and explain why, and then our well-being out of 10 and explain why. And often this takes us 20 minutes to get through at the start of a meeting. But it does mean that we all have an appreciation of one another. We know where we're coming from. If someone's wrestling with their elderly mother in a hospital on a COVID ward, then we all know that, and we kind of know where that person's coming from in the meeting. So it means that the collaboration comes a lot easier, and some of the potential tensions are kind of removed. So I think when we talk about inclusive culture, it's not just about the big things. We've got to embed the small little things that really make the environment comfortable for people to be inclusive within.
And that's another great example of what you can do, and perhaps speaks to Helena's point about empathy and ensuring that you kind of understand where everyone's coming from.
Yeah, the first time we did this, so we had a senior member of the team who actually shared the story, which he'd never shared before, that he had an elderly mother in a care home that he was sorting out the previous weekend. And it was a real revelation to the younger member of the team who thought they were just skiving off on the previous Friday. And it really created a real shift in attitude between those two individuals, that potentially there'd been some conflict before around working flexibility or whatever, and just this knowledge removed that issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think probably before we turn to the sort of final topic, which is looking at the sort of impact of COVID, perhaps Russell, if there are any questions that have come through.
Yes, Jane, there's been a number of they're all great questions. One from Sahini Petri, and apologies if I mispronounce your name, asking the panel's view as to whether inclusive leadership should really go beyond the behaviours, within the organisation, to thinking about it from a much broader systematic basis, where, in other words, who are your suppliers? Who do you want to partner with? Who are your clients? Who do you invest in? In other words, should the debate be taken to an even higher level?
Does anyone want to sort of take that one on?
Well, I'm not going to talk over Helena because she's going to have to talk about the diversity project. But I do know from my perspective, I have been invited to attend workshops with some of our suppliers to share best practice, so that we ensure that we are all on the same page as the way that we deal with things. And we personally have a kind of due diligence questionnaire that we kind of send to our suppliers, because we feel that we need to be of a similar culture if we're gonna work together.
So on the diversity project, which is on a mission to try and create an inclusive culture within the investment and savings industry, and also to improve diversity in all dimensions. I think what Steve's referring to here is, we're trying to create this joined up, this sort of sense that every part of the chain is all looking for the same thing. So it is really important to this initiative that we have organizations like Steve's company, a pension fund consulting company, as part of the initiative. It's not just asset managers sort of sorting themselves out, but we've got asset owners, pension fund consultants, asset managers, and other sort of partners like search firms and regulator and so forth. And we're trying to create this sort of sense that we're setting ourselves all the same sort of standard, or at least raising the bar on our standards here. I think it's hard to measure from the outside inclusive leadership. We've been struggling to get good sort of consistent data around diversity and so forth, and we're getting closer to a sort of set of like a template where firms who manage money, asset owners who are obviously wanting to make sure that their pension fund their managers have good standards, and their consultants similarly all agree on the framework for that. So I think it's a great idea to run workshops together to bring ourselves to. We've all got a shared problem here, that we are not, any of us, perfect, and if we can aspire to similar standards, I think it would hugely help to create the momentum and a bit of pressure on people who are not quite up with the program, as it were.
And I think we've seen some examples in the last few months of organizations that have sort of been demanding of the companies they're investing in that they raise their standards, but perhaps are not adopting those same standards themselves. So I think that it's important that we are sort of walking the talk, if I get that right. Yeah, walking the talk. Thank you for that. I'd now like to move on to the sort of final section of the conversation, which is about the impact of COVID. And Thomas, if we could launch the second poll, that would be great.
Yes, Jane, just bringing that up now. The question is, I am optimistic that post-COVID, my organisation will be more inclusive than pre-COVID, launching that now.
So as before, you can answer from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Obviously, organisations have been through, and their employees have been through a lot in the last year, and there's been a lot of changes and lots of shifts of views around things like working from home, etc. So it'll be interesting to see what the results are.
And the responses have just gone beyond 80%. So a good response rate again. I think we can probably close it there, Jane.
That would be great. Yes.
Just share the results now.
So there's some reason to be optimism there, with 50% or so agreeing or strongly agreeing. But there's still a fair chunk that are neutral on that point. So still sounds like there's some work to be done. So thank you very much for taking part in that poll. We can probably close that down. So, COVID, working from home, the terrible events of last year involving the death of George Floyd and so on have all had a big impact on organisations around inclusion and diversity in the last 12 months. So, Dean, I know that the events of the last year had a big impact on your thinking. And you recently wrote a wonderful blog about kind of how your thinking had shifted over the course of the year. Perhaps you could share some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, in 2020, we obviously had the COVID crisis to deal with and all of the burdens and mental health issues that employees had. But at the same time, the death of George Floyd in the US, really it compounded such a difficult time. And for us, the confluence of the COVID issue and also heightened alert around racial equality and social justice all kind of came together. And it really, when you think of leadership, and if your predisposition is servant leadership, where you're there to serve your people and serve your employees, it was impossible to not see the hurt and the needs of huge subsets of our employee populations. So I think all of those things have to be addressed. I think basically the call is on leaders to do far more for their employees. And even if an organization has already been really well evolved in the areas of diversity, equity, inclusion, there's always room for progress, and there's always room for a lot more progress going forward. So I think it is a call on leaders to continually try to be better, to look beyond just their own walls and look at all the systemic things that may be impacting their employees, even if those things don't directly have to do with the employer itself. It's incumbent upon good leaders, and especially on servant leader-minded individuals, to do everything they can to support their employees, to be empathetic, to hear, to listen, to take action, and to do things beyond just the four walls of your company, and to get more active in your communities and look for ways to influence the systemic issues that still exist. So I know a lot in there, but I think the need is clear, and I think there should be optimism going forward, because I think all that we learned during 2020 involving both race and the COVID crisis should make all of us better leaders going forward.
Thank you. And I think you became the executive sponsor for your African-American colleagues there. Is that right? That's
right. That's right. So following the events of 2020, a group of courageous individuals from within my organization formed what is called the Black Leadership Council at Buck. And I had the privilege of being asked to be their executive ally. And so it's really important for leaders to think of that as well. Allyship and championing the grassroots organizations that might pop up in your organization, they need to be supported. They need executive support, they need leadership support. So that has been a wonderful journey for us as an organization to go through. And I'm thankful for that group of courageous individuals to we keep talking about this theme of reverse mentoring and leading from not just the top, but leading from the bottom up. And we as leaders need to allow that to happen. So that's a great example. The Black Leadership Council has done that for us at Bach.
Fantastic. Steve, what impact has sort of the COVID experience had on you and your thoughts about leadership?
Yeah, it's had quite a significant impact in the way that I communicate and the way that we communicate across the business. So pre-COVID, I was getting constant feedback through kind of staff pulse surveys that they weren't getting enough communication. And over a period of a couple of years, I just stepped up the communication. I mean, we have 11 regional offices, so I'd be traveling around the regional offices giving presentations, written communication. I used to do a quarterly video interview, but we still had this constant, we want more communication. So when COVID hit and we all moved home and we moved on to Microsoft Teams, one of the first things I did was establish a town hall style meeting on Microsoft Teams for the whole business. And I made the decision not to prepare for my presentation, but just to have a few bullet points of things that I wanted to talk about. And the resulting fact was that they saw the unpolished me. They saw the kind of honest, authentic me. And that landed really well. And it kind of addressed some of the people's concerns about the volume of communication they were getting. What they're actually asking for was honesty and authenticity rather than actual information. The other thing that we're able to do in these town hall meetings, because I couldn't talk for an hour, was to invite other people onto the call. So we'd have panel discussions, and I invited our working parents to have a panel discussion. And it gave an opportunity for people perhaps with a lower profile to be seen across the business, and for conversations to be had that, publicly in front of the whole business that weren't happening. So there was some real insight given by those that were kind of wrestling with homeschooling and everything else that goes with it, that half of the business were unaware of. So we were really able to raise the profile of certain issues in this kind of public forum for the whole business. And I know none of that is groundbreaking, but it really shifted the I think cultural and communication issues within the business. So a real positive to come out of COVID.
And Helena, thank you for that, Steve. Helena, have you seen any good examples of good practice from working through COVID?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps if I can just share a general observation, which I think is backed up by some data that came out from the Global Institute of Women's Leadership, which is a King's College London initiative, and it's chaired by Julia Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia. And they partnered with a group called My Confidence Matters, and they did a survey which suggested that 92% of both men and women said that they felt their leaders, their manager, had become more empathetic during the pandemic. And I mean, that was staggering. That was, it was just way off the charts in terms of the other findings. And I suppose there's been a sense where people, perhaps ironically, we've been working remotely, and yet we've had glimpses into each other's lives that we hadn't had before. Was one thing, people didn't know much about their colleague who they might have been sitting next to for 5 years, and suddenly they see their pets or their home or their children or whatever. And I think as well, people have become attuned to this well-being issue, obviously, and being quite concerned about the well-being of some of their colleagues, and realizing there's more that it's gone on as well, how it's taken its toll, the pandemic, on a lot of aspects of our health. And so I think this is a real sort of, silver lining and something to build on. I use the word as one of my key criteria for inclusive leadership, that people need to be empathetic. So I'm encouraged by that. I also think that the etiquette around Zoom or Teams meetings is quite egalitarian. It's created a bit of a level playing field. There's no sort of subtle hierarchy from the seating plan, or you don't have to be the loudest voice to raise your hand. You can literally use the little button. And I think, although obviously there have been a lot of downsides and difficulties in people's lives, that has given people a voice that they might not have had before. So those two things, quite different perhaps, but the practical side in terms of a more of an even hand around meetings and then this glimpse into lives. I think my hope is that we build back more equally, and we build back with more awareness of each other, because we've all been through this terrible experience. It's blighted everybody's lives in some ways, obviously some people much more than others, but that is my hope.
Thanks, Helena. And Tracey, anything to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I think just quickly, there's three things, but it's really around how I hope that we all learn from what we've gone through in the last 12 months and continue to take the great learnings forward, because I think that's critical. But three things that came about, I think, for me, is around how there's just an increased communication. People have to make a better effort to communicate when we've gone online. And I think if we can keep that presence and the leader presence and the accessibility of everyone reaching the leaders, like Helena says, online you have an equal level playing field, and you can also have your voice heard because you can ask questions and everyone can read them, whereas normally sometimes you don't get that airtime. So it's that hidden airtime that we get, and that the communication lines stay open. Secondly, I think is around the fact that we're able to engage with the disengaged and use the allies to actually engage with people that we've never ever allowed to get involved before. So that's a really inclusion point that we have to really think about and really continue to do in the future. The third one is around accessibility. We've had an opportunity of going online to reach wider customer base and tap into the untapped talent. So that's about people who are, juggling all kinds of things at home, people who are disabled, they're able to work from home much easier, people who have never even had a chance to come into the employment market but can do. So it's tapping into those untapped customer bases and untapped talent. And if we can continue to actually work on evolving that inclusive leadership approach and learn from that, I think that'd be a great place to be.
Fantastic, thank you. I think we've got time for maybe one or two questions. So Russell, are there any other key questions that have come through?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. One on this, looking forward post-COVID, Rosalind Rosau is asking the question, and I guess it depends how we respond to the situation, but there could be a concern that, for example, if more females using technology were working from home, could that in itself create is a risk of a new boys club being established in the work environment? So it'd be interesting to hear what the panel.
I might turn to Helena, because I know we've talked about this a fair bit.
Yeah, and I think it was the experience when certainly in the UK we went back to work in the summer and early autumn last year, and anecdotally, and I didn't see any research on it, but people reported that men were more likely to be back, and that had created a them and us kind of sense. I do think it's important. I mean, we'll never get gender equality or anything approaching it unless we have, or at work and career opportunities are equal for men and women, unless we have more equality at home. And I think, if companies, which all the companies that I work with, are very keen that there's a hybrid working and that they capture some of the benefits of more flexibility, less real estate costs, less commuting and so forth. But I think they have to make it very, prescriptive in a way of everybody. It's between, 2, 3 or 4 days in the office and the similar number of days at home, rather than letting people, some people just elect to come back full time and some people elect to stay at home all the time. There are obviously great benefits from collaboration, innovation. We've talked about some of the benefits of inclusion. I do think it's tricky to do all of that entirely remotely, and perhaps we're seeing the sort of fraying at the edges in some forum at the moment where people are sort of worn down by the whole year and just need to kind of get into the office again. So I do hope that companies, and I would encourage companies to think, we'll make it at least a guide to people of what they're expecting, and try to make it, or try to encourage women to spend some time in the office, encourage men to spend some time at home. Some dads have told me quite off their own back that they've really enjoyed spending time at home. And in that same survey that I mentioned from King's College, interestingly, 23% of the men surveyed said they wanted to work full-time at home, and only 17% of the women. I thought maybe because the men had been left in peace a bit more than the women. But anyway, it was quite interesting. It was a very similar number that wanted to have a hybrid, and we just need to push on that, I think.
Yeah, and I certainly think it's not just people with family commitments.
No.
It's also some of your introverts who really quite like just sort of working from home, head down, no distractions, not having to say hello to people, etc. So it suits a variety of people.
So we've had a conversation in the business just in the last week about the kind of return to the office, and there may be some people that don't want to return to the office, and my steer to the management team is if that's going to happen, then you're going to have to work much harder to make sure that this person continues to have the profile within the business, because otherwise they'll be tucked in the corner of the business and their career will be stifled because of it. So that you need to make sure they're in project groups, they're presenting on company presentations, they are coming into the office occasionally to have profile, because it's not good for the business to have people tucked away and never seen. You know, we want everyone in the business that's ambitious and keen to grow their career. So if we have got people working from home, it's an extra burden on the managers to kind of make sure that we're on top of that.
Yeah, great advice. Thank you. Maybe time for one quick question, Russell.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. There's a question relating to building allies. I think you referred to that, Dean, earlier. How effective or important is that in building an inclusive leadership environment?
Yeah, it's critical. I suppose it's good to know of your whole leadership team or of your whole kind of senior leadership team. You have to figure out who's willing to step up. Maybe this gets into the bravery comment from before. So as long as you have a few brave leaders that are willing to step up and be the allies, then I think there's hope and you're good. You know, it's the organizations where no one on the executive team or no one on the senior leadership team feels the safety to be brave enough to step up and be an ally, and that's maybe where an organization will have challenges. But it really only takes one, and I'd encourage all the leaders out there on this call just to be that brave one that will step up to be an ally.
Well, on that wonderful positive note, I think we're running out of time. So thank you very much indeed to the panel for fantastic discussion. And in particular, I think sharing some of your sort of personal stories and examples of what inclusive leadership is about. So turning the sort of theory into some really tangible examples. There were a number of questions that we haven't been able to answer. So I'm going to try and persuade the panelists. I don't think they'll take a lot of persuading to help answer those afterwards. So we'll get those back out to you as soon as we can. But thank you for the flow of questions. I'm now going to hand back to Thomas to do the wrap up.
Thanks ever so much, Jane. It really only remains for me to thank our panelists, Dean, Steve, Helena and Tracey. I just want to list a few points that really caught my ear in the discussions there. From Steve, enlist the help of a reverse mentor. I'm sure we all heard that one, Steve. And score your life and work and well-being out of 10 around that table. I thought that was great, Steve. Well done. From Tracey, we, not me. Engage with the disengaged, tap into the untapped talent. Wonderful, Tracey. Openness and honesty, curiosity, big ideas, and breaking down silos. And then from Helena, people need to be empathetic. Virtual reality has given people a voice. More dads wanting to work from home, great to hear. And leap before you look. And if you want to hear Helena talking more about that, as I said earlier, do log on to Radio 4's Desert Island Discs. You can hear Helena talking about that. Finally, Dean, there's a call on leaders to do far more. Brave leaders step up. And if you want to read Dean's article, then please go on to the Inclusion Solution. You can search for Dean's article there. It's entitled Operationalizing Justice, What One White Leader is Learning on the Journey. So thanks once again to our panelists, really much appreciated. A lot to learn and take in there. And thanks to you, our guests, for joining us today, for engaging with us through the Q&A. As you can see, the session will be recorded and made available through the Leading Figures website in the next few days. And if you want to learn more about our research, then do contact us through the info@Leading Figures email address. But in the meantime, thanks once again to everyone and a very good day. Thank you.